The old man slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the blinding light of the morning sun. His bones ached, and he felt the cold of the concrete beneath his frail body. For a moment, he lay still, trying to figure out where he was and how he had ended up there. The streets around him buzzed with morning traffic, but to him, everything seemed like a distant, incomprehensible blur. He tried to sit up, his muscles protesting with every movement. He looked at his wrinkled hands, covered in dirt, and frowned. Were these his hands? He couldn't remember. A hurried man walked past him, nearly tripping over his outstretched legs. "Hey, old man, get out of the way!" the man yelled angrily, not even slowing down. The elderly man flinched, startled by the sudden hostility. He looked around, desperate for something familiar, anything that could anchor his drifting mind. But every building, every passing face, was strange and threatening. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest. "Where am I?" he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and shaky. "Who am I?" The questions echoed in his mind, unanswered. He tried to stand, his shaky legs barely holding him up. He took one hesitant step, then another, shuffling along the sidewalk like a rudderless boat. People passed him by, some casting looks of pity, others turning their gaze away, pretending not to see his pitiful state. He wanted to shout, to ask for help, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he ask for help when he didn't even know who he was or what he needed? His eyes fell on a storefront window, and he stopped, shocked by the reflection staring back at him. A wrinkled face, disheveled white hair, faded blue eyes full of confusion and fear. Was that him? He didn't recognize the man in the reflection, but deep in his foggy mind, he knew that image was his. A single tear rolled down his dirty cheek as he continued his aimless walk, lost not just in the streets of the city, but also in the labyrinth of his own mind. Every step took him further from a past he couldn't remember, and toward a future he couldn't imagine. As he wandered aimlessly through the busy streets, flashes of memory started to surface in the old man's mind, like old, faded photographs. A wooden house with a swing in the yard, the distant sound of children's laughter, the smell of freshly baked apple pie. He stopped, closing his eyes tightly, trying to hold on to these fleeting memories, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. The more he tried, the more they slipped away. "Emily," he whispered, the name coming to his lips out of nowhere. Who was Emily? A daughter? A wife? The image of a young woman with brown hair and a gentle smile flashed in his mind, but disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He kept walking, his unsteady steps taking him down unfamiliar streets. He passed a school, the sound of children playing in the yard tightening his heart with a longing he didn't understand. Had he once been a teacher? A father? A dog barked in a nearby yard, and suddenly he found himself remembering a golden retriever, running toward him with a ball in its mouth. "Rex," he murmured, almost smiling at the memory. But where was Rex now? How long ago had that been? The smell of fresh coffee drew him toward a small cafe. He stood on the sidewalk, looking through the window, watching people inside chatting cheerfully. For a moment, he saw himself sitting at a table, laughing with friends over a steaming cup. But they were faces without names, voices without sound. His eyes fell on his dirty, torn clothes, and he quickly stepped away from the storefront, ashamed. How had he ended up like this? He tried to remember his job, his home, his family, but all he found were painful voids where his memories should have been. A woman walked past him, and her perfume triggered another memory. A garden full of roses, delicate hands tending to the flowers. His mother, his wife. The image vanished before he could grasp it. He sat down on a park bench, physically and emotionally drained. People hurried by, each with their own destination, their own story. And there he was, a book with blank pages, struggling to remember even his own name. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The old man looked up, feeling a pang of familiarity. How many sunsets had he watched in his life? How many precious moments were lost in the fog of his mind? He closed his eyes, letting the tears finally fall. Every fragment of memory was like a piece of a giant, incomplete puzzle. Who was he? Where did he come from? And more importantly, was there someone, somewhere, missing him? The next day dawned gray and cold, reflecting the old man's mood. He had spent the night in an alley, curled up between cardboard boxes, his restless sleep filled with confusing dreams and nameless faces. He dragged himself out of his makeshift shelter, his sore muscles protesting with every movement. His stomach growled with hunger, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in days. With hesitant steps, he returned to the busy streets, hoping, for what? He didn't even know. That's when he saw her. A middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled into a loose bun, standing across the street. She was watching him with a look that mixed curiosity and recognition. The old man's heart raced. Did she know him? Could she be the key to unlocking the mystery of his lost identity? He took a step toward the street, eager to reach her. But at that moment, the light turned green, and a wave of pedestrians flooded the crosswalk. By the time he finally made it across, the woman had disappeared. Desperate, he looked around, searching for that face that, for a brief moment, had seemed like a beacon in the middle of his sea of confusion. "Wait!" he shouted, his hoarse voice barely audible over the noise of the traffic. A few people glanced in his direction, startled, before quickly moving away. But where had she gone? He began walking faster, ignoring the pain in his joints, his eyes scanning every face in the crowd. In his mind, the image of the woman blended with other fragmented memories. Did he know her? From where? "Please," he muttered to himself, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Please, come back. Do you know me? Do you know who I am?" But the streets remained indifferent to his pleas. People continued with their daily routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding right there among them. A man lost, not only in the city streets but also in the depths of his own mind. The old man finally stopped, exhausted and defeated. Maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe that look of recognition had just been a trick of his mind, desperate for connection. He leaned against a wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the ground. People passed by him, some casting pitying glances, others pretending not to see him. But his eyes kept searching, hoping to spot that familiar face again in the crowd. As the day wore on, his hope began to fade. But something had changed. That brief moment of connection, real or imagined, had sparked something inside him. For the first time since he woke up on that cold sidewalk, he felt a sense of purpose. He would find that woman again. And with her, perhaps he would find himself. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next in a blur of unfamiliar faces and nameless streets. The old man wandered through the city, his eyes constantly searching for the woman's face, the one who, for a brief moment, seemed to recognize him. It was on a particularly cold afternoon when something unexpected happened. Sitting on a park bench, watching the children play on the nearby playground, a familiar scent hit his nose: popcorn. The sweet and salty aroma stirred something deep in his memory. Suddenly, he was somewhere else, in another time. It was a summer day, and he was at an amusement park. The sound of laughter and the cheerful music from the carousels filled the air. He was holding the hand of a little girl, his daughter, as they walked among the colorful booths. "Daddy, I want popcorn!" The child's voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if it had been yesterday. He could feel the smile on his own face as he bought her a warm bag of popcorn. The memory was so vivid, so real, that when he returned to the present, his hands were outstretched, as if still holding that bag of popcorn from years ago. Tears flowed freely down his wrinkled face. "Sarah," he whispered, the name surfacing from the depths of his mind. Sarah, his daughter. How could he have forgotten her? Where was she now? How many years had passed? He stood up from the bench, a new energy coursing through his tired body. He had to find her. But how? He didn't know her last name, didn't know where they lived, didn't even know his own name. He approached a woman walking by with her child, "Please," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Can you help me find my daughter? Her name is Sarah." The woman looked at him with a mixture of pity and distrust, pulling her child closer. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied, quickly walking away. "I can't help you." The old man stood still, watching her walk away. He realized how he must have looked. An elderly man, dirty and confused, asking for help to find someone who probably didn't exist anymore. But she existed. Sarah was real. The memory of the amusement park, the smell of popcorn, the sound of her laughter. It was all real, buried under years of forgetting, but real. He sat back down on the bench, closing his eyes and concentrating. If he could remember Sarah, maybe he could remember more. Who was he? Where was his home? What had happened to leave him on the streets, lost and alone? The answers didn't come easily. Every memory felt like digging in the sand with bare hands, only uncovering fragments and scattered pieces, but he wouldn't give up. Sarah was out there somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, she was looking for him too. With renewed determination, the old man stood up. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. He looked toward the horizon, feeling a mix of hope and fear of the unknown. His journey was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. Nightfall settled over the city, streetlights and car headlights casting a surreal glow on the busy streets. The old man walked slowly, his footsteps echoing on the cold concrete. The memory of Sarah still burned in his mind, a beacon of hope in the darkness of his amnesia. He passed by a storefront, his ghostly reflection staring back at him. Who was that man with white hair and tired eyes? He stopped, studying every line and wrinkle on his face, searching for clues to his lost identity. That's when he heard it. A whisper, almost inaudible amidst the noise of the city at night. Harold. The name floated in the air as if carried by the wind. He turned sharply, searching for the source of that familiar voice. Harold, he repeated to himself, testing the sound on his tongue. Was that his name? It felt right, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. "My name is Harold," he said out loud, feeling a wave of relief and recognition wash over him. It was as if a part of him, long lost, had finally returned. With that small fragment of his identity recovered, Harold, yes, he was sure now that this was his name, felt reinvigorated. He continued walking, this time with renewed purpose. Each step brought him closer to his past, to his forgotten life. He passed by a small park, where couples strolled hand in hand and children played in the last hours before nightfall. A little girl ran past him, laughing, and for a moment he saw Sarah again, her laughter echoing through the years. "Sarah," he called softly. But the girl had already passed, leaving only the echo of her laughter in the evening air. Harold sat down on a nearby bench, watching the families in the park. Every smiling face, every loving embrace was a painful reminder of what he had lost. Or was it still out there somewhere, waiting for him to find his way back? He closed his eyes, trying to focus. Harold, Sarah. Two names, two anchors in a sea of forgetfulness. There was more, he knew. There had to be more. Emily, he whispered, remembering the name that had surfaced in his mind days earlier. Who was Emily? His wife. Sarah's mother. The questions piled up, each one bringing more confusion than answers. A cold wind blew, making Harold shiver in his thin, worn-out clothes. He stood up, knowing he needed to find somewhere to spend the night. But where could he go? Every street, every alley felt equally strange and hostile. As he walked, Harold began murmuring the names to himself like a mantra. Harold, Sarah, Emily. He repeated them over and over, afraid he might forget them again if he stopped. The streets grew emptier as the night wore on. Harold kept walking, his sore feet carrying him aimlessly through the sleeping city. In every shadow, in every reflection in the dark windows, he searched for clues to his past. Suddenly, he stopped. In front of him, illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight, was a street sign. Oak Street, he read aloud. Something about the name made his heart leap. It was familiar, achingly familiar. Without thinking, he turned down the street, his steps growing more urgent. The houses lined up on both sides seemed to watch him, silent witnesses to his desperate search. Number 12, 14, 16. Harold stopped in front of number 18, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The house was dark and quiet, but something about it called to him. The swing in the yard, the white fence, the rose bushes by the porch, it all seemed to come straight out of a long-forgotten dream. Harold stood still, staring at the house. Could this be it? Had he finally found his home? And if it was, what would he do now? Who would be inside? Would they recognize the ragged old man standing on the sidewalk as the person who once lived there? With trembling hands, he opened the small gate in the fence. The familiar creak made his heart ache. Slowly, as if walking through a dream, Harold climbed the porch steps. He stood in front of the door, his ghostly reflection staring back at him through the glass. He took a deep breath, gathering all the courage he had left. It was time to face his past, to rediscover who Harold really was. With his heart in his throat, he raised his hand and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the silent house, marking the end of one journey and the potential beginning of another. Harold waited, each second feeling like an eternity, as the sound of footsteps approached from the other side of the door. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, but no one came to answer. Harold stood on the porch for what felt like long minutes, his heart sinking with each passing moment of silence. Finally, defeated, he descended the steps and returned to the street. Disappointment weighed heavily on his shoulders as he wandered aimlessly through the early morning hours. By the time the sun began to rise, Harold found himself standing in front of a small cafe on the corner. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread made his stomach growl, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in days. Hesitant, he stepped inside. A bell jingled, announcing his arrival, and a few heads turned to look at him. Harold felt out of place in his dirty, worn clothes, but the warm, inviting atmosphere made him stay. He sat down at a table in the corner, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. A young waitress approached, her smile faltering slightly when she saw the state Harold was in. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice kind despite the hesitation in her eyes. Harold opened his mouth to respond, but realized he had no money. I'm sorry," he mumbled, starting to stand up. "I don't have any way to pay." The waitress looked at him for a long moment. Then her expression softened. "Wait here," she said, before quickly walking away. Harold sat there, feeling both embarrassed and confused. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of eggs and toast. "It's on the house," she said with a warm smile. "You look like you could use a good breakfast." Tears welled up in Harold's eyes at this unexpected act of kindness. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he ate slowly, savoring each bite. Harold watched the bustle of the cafe. People came and went, some rushing off to work, others leisurely enjoying a calm morning. That's when he saw her. The gray-haired woman he had spotted on the street days ago. She was sitting a few tables away, reading a newspaper and sipping coffee. Harold's heart raced. This was his chance. Gathering all his courage, he stood up and walked over to her table. "Excuse me," he said softly. The woman looked up from her newspaper, and Harold saw the exact moment when recognition lit up her face. "Harold?" she asked, her voice a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "Is it really you?" The sound of his name on her lips sparked something in Harold's mind. Memories began to surface, hazy but undeniable. "Margaret," he said, the name coming from somewhere deep in his consciousness. You know me." Margaret stood up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Oh, Harold," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We thought you had died. Where have you been all these years?" Harold felt his legs grow weak, and Margaret helped him sit down. The questions piled up in his mind, but one stood out above all the others. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Who am I?" Margaret held Harold's trembling hands, her eyes filled with compassion and concern. "Harold," she began gently, "you don't remember anything?" He shook his head, silent tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Just fragments. Sarah, Emily, the house on Oak Street. But it's all so confusing." Margaret took a deep breath, as if preparing to tell a difficult story. "Harold, you are a retired teacher. We worked together for years at Maple Grove Elementary. The students always adored you. You were so patient and kind." Her words triggered a flood of images in his mind. A classroom full of smiling faces, the smell of chalk, the sound of children's laughter. Harold closed his eyes, letting the memories flow. "Sarah is your daughter," Margaret continued, "and Emily was your wife." The past tense didn't go unnoticed by Harold. "Was?" he asked, his heart tightening with sudden fear. Margaret nodded sadly. "Emily passed away 5 years ago, Harold. After that, you started having memory problems. Your family was worried, but you kept insisting you were fine. Then, one day, you just disappeared. That was almost 2 years ago." Harold felt as if the world was spinning around him. Emily gone, and he had been missing for 2 years. How could he have forgotten all of this? "And Sarah?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She never gave up looking for you," Margaret said, a small smile forming on her lips. "She put up ads, hired detectives. She's going to be so relieved to know you're alive." Harold felt a wave of mixed emotions, relief at being remembered, guilt for causing so much worry, and a deep sadness over losing Emily, a loss he couldn't even recall experiencing. "I want to see her," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Can I see Sarah?" Margaret nodded, already reaching for her phone. "I'll call her right now. She's going to want to come immediately." As Margaret made the call, Harold sat in silence, trying to process everything he had just learned. He was a teacher, a widower, a father. He had a life, a story, an identity beyond the confused old man who wandered the streets. The cafe around them continued its morning hum, unaware of the drama unfolding at the corner table. Harold looked out the window, seeing the city that had seemed so strange and hostile for so long. Now, with each new revelation, it was starting to feel more familiar, more like home. Margaret hung up the phone, a broad smile on her face. "Sarah's on her way," she said, squeezing Harold's hand. She couldn't believe it. She was crying with joy. Harold felt his own heart race at the thought of seeing his daughter. But along with the joy came fear. What if he didn't recognize her? What if she looked at him and saw only a stranger? "Margaret," he said, his voice trembling, "what if I don't remember her when I see her?" Margaret smiled kindly. "The heart remembers, Harold, even when the mind forgets. When you see Sarah, you'll know. She's your daughter, after all." Harold nodded, trying to hold on to that hope. As they waited, Margaret began to share more about his past life, each story awakening more forgotten memories. And so, in that small cafe on the corner, Harold began to piece together the fragments of his broken life, both anxious and hopeful for the reunion that would soon change everything again. Time seemed to crawl as Harold and Margaret waited for Sarah to arrive. Each minute was filled with stories from the past, each one a piece of the puzzle of his lost existence. "Do you remember when you organized that school play?" Margaret asked, her eyes twinkling at the memory. "You turned Romeo and Juliet into a musical comedy. The parents didn't know whether to laugh or cry." Harold furrowed his brow, concentrating. For a moment, he saw flashes of children in makeshift costumes, heard the sound of laughter mixed with awkward Shakespearean dialogue. A hesitant smile appeared on his face. "I think I remember. Little Tommy fell off the balcony, didn't he?" Margaret laughed, nodding enthusiastically. "Exactly. You caught him just in time. You were always so attentive with the kids." Each story brought with it a wave of emotions and fragmented memories. Harold found himself laughing at past adventures he could barely recall and crying over losses that his heart recognized before his mind could fully grasp. "And Emily?" he asked softly, his heart tightening at the thought of the wife he had lost and forgotten. "What was she like?" Margaret's face softened with a mix of affection and sadness. "Emily was light, Harold. She lit up every room she walked into. You two were so in love, even after all those years together. She was a music teacher. Did you know that? You met at the school." Harold closed his eyes, letting Margaret's words paint a picture in his mind. For a moment, he could see Emily, wavy brown hair, bright green eyes, a smile that seemed to light up the world. The distant sound of a piano playing softly echoed in his memory. "She played Chopin," Harold murmured, the memory surfacing suddenly. "On summer nights, with the windows open." Margaret squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "Yes, Harold, she loved Chopin." The jingle of the cafe door interrupted the moment. Harold looked up, his heart nearly stopping when he saw the woman who had just walked in. She was breathless, as if she had run the whole way there. Her eyes, the same shade of blue as his, scanned the cafe frantically until they landed on him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Dad?" Her voice trembled, filled with hope and fear. Harold stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. He looked at her face, so familiar and yet so changed. She was no longer the little girl from his fragmented memories, but a grown woman, and yet he recognized her instantly. "Sarah," he whispered, opening his arms. In a heartbeat, she was there, hugging him tightly, sobbing into his chest. Harold held her, feeling the tears stream down his own face. It didn't matter that he couldn't remember every moment of their life together. In that instant, he knew, with every fiber of his being, that this was his daughter. "I looked everywhere for you," Sarah sobbed. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Harold stroked her hair, just as he must have done thousands of times before. "I'm here now, sweetheart," he murmured. "I'm here." As he held his daughter, Harold felt the pieces of his life beginning to fit back together. There was still so much to remember, so much to rediscover. But there, in that cafe, with Sarah in his arms and Margaret watching with tears in her eyes, he knew he had found his way back home. In the days that followed the emotional reunion at the cafe, Harold found himself on an emotional roller coaster of discoveries. Sarah took him to her home, a cozy apartment in the city center, so different from the house on Oak Street that lingered in his fragmented memories. "Oh, you sold the house after Mom passed," Sarah explained gently, noticing the confusion in Harold's eyes. "You said there were too many memories there." Harold nodded slowly, feeling a pang of sadness. Another piece of his past lost while he wandered aimlessly through the streets. Sarah did her best to help him readjust, showing him family photos, telling him stories of his childhood, trying to awaken more memories. Sometimes it worked. A smell, a song, or an image would trigger a flood of memories. Other times, Harold felt like a stranger watching someone else's life. One afternoon, as they flipped through a photo album, Harold stopped at a picture of himself and Emily. They were on a beach, radiant smiles on their faces, the setting sun painting the sky behind them. "That was our last trip together," Sarah said softly, "before Mom got sick." Harold traced the outline of Emily's face in the photo with his trembling finger. "I wish I could remember," he murmured. "It feels so unfair that I've forgotten so many precious moments." Sarah held his hand. "You didn't forget, Dad. You just lost your way for a while. The memories are still there, somewhere." But as the days went by, Harold began to feel a growing discomfort. Sarah's apartment, though cozy, didn't feel like home. The streets of the city, once strange and hostile, now seemed oddly familiar, a constant reminder of his days spent wandering aimlessly. One night, unable to sleep, Harold got up and went to the window. He stared out at the lit-up city, feeling a strange sense of longing for something he couldn't quite name. "Dad?" Sarah's sleepy voice came from behind him. "Is everything okay?" Harold turned, seeing the concern in his daughter's eyes. I don't know, he admitted. Sarah, I'm grateful for everything you're doing, but this doesn't feel like home. Sarah came closer, hugging him. I know, Dad. It must be hard. Maybe we could visit the old house tomorrow. The new owners said they'd be happy to have us. Harold nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He was going back to Oak Street, to the house that filled his dreams and fragmented memories. The next morning, they made the trip. As the car stopped in front of the familiar house, Harold felt his heart race. The swing was still there, as were the rose bushes, though different flowers now adorned the garden. A young family greeted them at the door, a couple with 2 small children. They were kind and understanding, allowing Harold and Sarah to walk through the house. Every room brought a flood of emotions and memories. In the kitchen, Harold could almost smell Emily's cakes. In the master bedroom, he remembered nights spent reading to Sarah when she was little. But at the same time, everything felt different. The furniture wasn't the same. The walls were painted in new colors, and the laughter of unfamiliar children echoed through the hallways. As they left, Harold sat down on the porch steps, looking out at the quiet street. Sarah joined him, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. How do you feel, Dad? She asked softly. Harold was silent for a long moment, letting the emotions settle. It's strange, he finally said. It's familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I remember this place, Sarah. But it's not our home anymore, is it? Sarah shook her head, tears in her eyes. No, Dad, it's not. Harold looked at his daughter, seeing the love and concern in her eyes. He realized then that his true home wasn't a place. It was the people he loved, the memories they shared. Let's go home, sweetheart, he said, standing up and holding out his hand to Sarah. To your apartment. I think it's time we start making new memories there. Sarah smiled through her tears, taking her father's hand. Together, they walked back to the car, leaving behind the house on Oak Street. Not a home anymore, but a precious chapter in their family story. As they drove away, Harold felt a mix of sadness and hope. The home he had been searching for no longer existed, at least not the way he remembered it. But maybe, with Sarah by his side, he could build a new one. The weeks passed, and Harold gradually adjusted to his new life in Sarah's apartment. Each day brought new discoveries, some joyful, others painful. The fragments of his past continued to surface at unexpected moments, like stubborn ghosts that refused to fade away. One Saturday morning, Sarah suggested taking a walk around the neighborhood. There's a lovely park nearby, she said. We used to go there when I was little. Maybe it'll help stir up more memories. Harold agreed, eager to explore more of his forgotten past. As they walked through the sunny streets, he found himself looking at every passing face, every building, every tree, searching for something familiar. They turned a corner and came across a small bookstore. Harold stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on the storefront. I know this place, he murmured. Sarah smiled, gently squeezing his arm. Yes, Dad, you used to bring me here every Sunday. Do you remember? As if in response, a vivid memory came rushing back to Harold's mind. He saw himself holding the hand of a much younger Sarah, guiding her through shelves filled with books, the smell of paper and ink, the soft sound of pages turning, the excitement in his daughter's eyes as she picked out a new book to take home. It all returned in an overwhelming wave of emotion. You always picked adventure stories, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. And I read to you every night before bed. Sarah hugged him, tears in her eyes. Yes, Dad, you remember. They stepped into the bookstore, the bell above the door jingling softly. The interior was just as Harold remembered, cozy, with shelves that reached the ceiling and a lazy cat napping on the counter. An elderly woman looked up from the book she was reading. Her face lit up with recognition. Harold? Is that really you? Harold blinked, surprised. Yes, it's me. Do we know each other? The woman smiled warmly. I'm Edith, dear. You and Sarah were my most loyal customers. I was so worried when you disappeared." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Harold's mind. He remembered long conversations with Edith about literature, rainy afternoons spent in this bookstore, tucked away among the shelves with a cup of hot tea. "Edith," he said, smiling. "Of course. How could I have forgotten?" They spent the next hour in the bookstore, with Edith and Sarah helping Harold navigate through his literary memories. Every book he touched seemed to hold not just printed stories, but fragments of his own life story. As they left the bookstore, Harold felt both exhausted and refreshed. They continued their walk toward the park, but now every corner, every shop, every tree along the sidewalk seemed to echo with memories of his past. They passed a bakery, and the smell of fresh bread made Harold stop again. "Emily loved the croissants from here," he said softly, the memory surfacing on its own. Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, she bought a dozen every Saturday morning." They arrived at the park, and Harold felt another wave of recognition. The playground, the duck pond, the old oak tree where they used to have picnics. Everything was there, just as in his newly resurfaced memories. They sat down on a bench overlooking the pond. Harold stayed quiet for a long time, taking in everything he had experienced that morning. "It's strange," he finally said. "It's like the whole city is an album of memories. Every corner, every building has a story to tell." Sarah took his hand. "They're the ghosts of your past, Dad. But I think they're friendly ghosts. They're here to help you remember, not to haunt you." Harold nodded slowly. "You're right, it's just that sometimes it feels like too much. So many memories, so many emotions. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose." "It's okay, Dad," Sarah said softly. "You don't have to remember everything all at once. We have time." They sat there, watching the ducks on the pond and the families enjoying the sunny day. Harold let himself relax, allowing the memories to come naturally, without forcing them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Harold turned to his daughter. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, "for not giving up on me, for helping me find these ghosts of the past." Sarah smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Always, Dad, always." Together, they stood up and began walking back home. Harold knew there was still much to rediscover, much to process, but with Sarah by his side and the gentle ghosts of his past guiding the way, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The following months brought a mix of highs and lows for Harold. Each day was a new adventure in rediscovery, but also a constant reminder of everything he had lost. Visits to neurologists and therapists helped clarify his condition, a rare form of amnesia, triggered by the trauma of losing Emily and worsened by his years living on the streets. "Your mind created a defense mechanism," explained Dr. Ramirez, his neurologist. "To protect you from the pain of loss, it simply shut off large parts of your memory." Harold nodded slowly, trying to process the information. "Is there a chance I'll get it all back?" The doctor smiled kindly. "The brain is a remarkable organ, Mr. Thompson. We've seen cases of incredible recovery. But it's important that you focus not only on recovering the past, but also on building your present and future." Those words echoed in Harold's mind in the days that followed. He found himself torn between the desperate desire to recover every fragment of his past life and the need to move forward, to create new memories. One afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes in Sarah's apartment, Harold came across a photo album he hadn't seen before. As he opened it, he was greeted by images of himself, younger, smiling, full of life, captured in various moments from his teaching career. There were photos of him in the classroom, surrounded by smiling children, photos from graduations, school plays, science fairs. In every image, Harold could see the love and dedication in his own eyes. "I really loved teaching, didn't I?" he murmured to himself. Sarah, who was organizing another box nearby, looked up. "Yes, Dad, it was your passion. You always said there was nothing more rewarding than seeing the light of understanding in a student's eyes." Harold flipped through a few more pages, stopping at a photo of himself receiving a Teacher of the Year award. The memory of that day remained elusive, but he could feel the pride and satisfaction radiating from the image. At that moment, something clicked inside him. All these weeks, he had been so focused on recovering his past that he had neglected to think about his future. Who was he now? What did he want to do with the rest of his life? "Sarah," he said, closing the album gently, "I think I'd like to go back to teaching." His daughter looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure, Dad? Don't you think it might be too much?" Harold shook his head, feeling a sense of determination he hadn't felt in a long time. "It doesn't have to be full-time. Maybe I can start by volunteering, helping kids who are struggling. I just feel like I need to do something meaningful, you know? I can't just keep living in the past." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Dad. Let's see what we can arrange." In the weeks that followed, Harold threw himself into his new mission. With the help of Sarah and a few of his old colleagues who were thrilled to see him return, he began tutoring children at a local school. At first, it was challenging. There were days when the words didn't come easily, when he felt lost and inadequate. But there were also moments of pure joy, when a child finally grasped a difficult concept, when a shy student gained confidence, when he saw the same spark of enthusiasm in the children's eyes that he'd seen in those old photos. One afternoon, after a particularly rewarding session, Harold sat on a bench in the schoolyard. The sound of children's laughter echoed around him, blending with memories of his years as a teacher that were slowly resurfacing. Sarah, who had come to pick him up, sat down beside him. "How was today, Dad?" Harold smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. "It was good, sweetheart. Really good." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the children play. Then Harold turned to his daughter, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and determination. "You know, Sarah," he said softly, "I think I've finally figured something out. My past, all those memories we've lost and are rediscovering together, they matter. They shaped me. They shaped us. But they're not everything I am." Sarah took his hand, encouraging him to continue. "The present, this moment right here and now, is just as precious," Harold continued. "And the future? Well, it may be uncertain, but that doesn't mean we can't embrace it, shape it in our own way." Sarah hugged him, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Dad." As they walked home, Harold reflected on his journey. From waking up confused on that cold sidewalk to this very moment, it had been a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries. He knew there was still much to remember, much to heal, but for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace with the present and hopeful for the future. Harold smiled to himself. Maybe life was like this sunset, a constant balance between what was ending and what was just beginning. And he was ready to see what the new day would bring. Margaret, the old friend who had recognized Harold in that fateful cafe, became a constant presence in their lives. She brought with her stories from the past that helped fill the gaps in Harold's memory. Over time, a tender friendship blossomed between them, bringing both comfort and companionship in their golden years. The house on Oak Street, though no longer their physical home, remained an important symbol in their lives. Harold and Sarah started a tradition of visiting the neighborhood once a month, walking through the familiar streets and reminiscing about old stories. The young family now living there welcomed them warmly, allowing Harold to show Sarah the room where she grew up and the garden where Emily used to tend her roses. As time passed, Harold's memories continued to return, not as a sudden flood, but as a gentle, steady stream. Each new memory was celebrated, each gap filled was a victory. But most importantly, Harold learned to treasure not just the memories he was recovering, but the new ones he was creating each day. On his 70th birthday, surrounded by Sarah, his grandchildren, whom he'd met for the first time after his return, Margaret, and a room full of current and former students, Harold found himself reflecting on his extraordinary journey. From a man lost and without memories, wandering the streets, he had transformed once again into a loving father, a proud grandfather, a cherished friend, and a respected teacher. Looking at the smiling faces around him, Harold felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. He had lost so much, but he had also gained so much. His life, though different from what he might have imagined, was rich with love, purpose, and new possibilities. As he blew out the candles on his cake, Harold made a silent wish, not to recover more memories from the past, but to create even more precious moments in the future. And when he opened his eyes to see Sarah's radiant smile, he knew that his wish was already coming true. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Give this video a like to help us reach more people with messages of hope and resilience. And tell us in the comments, what part of this story resonated with you the most? Your participation inspires us to continue sharing stories that make a difference. Remember, each new day is an opportunity to create precious memories and positively impact the lives of others. Until the next story, take care and spread love wherever you go. God bless you.